In Memory of Herman Dooyeweerd, Meaning, Time and Law by Johan van der Hoeven. This is a slightly adapted version of the paper given for the Dooyeweerd Memorial Colloquium at Calvin College, Grand Rapids, Michigan, USA, March 7th, 1978, and published in the same year in Philosophia Reformata. What follows is the first section on the key term meaning. How to commemorate him in a relatively short paper, and, for a professionally speaking, somewhat mixed audience. I have opted for an approach in terms of a few words which, I believe, can properly be called key words. This means, among other things, that the exposition is intended mainly as an attempt at elucidation and personal interpretation, and not so much as strict and elaborate argument. If my key words are real keys indeed, then they are supposed to fit and to open three main doors to Dooyeweerd's work, which, in turn, should make it possible to acquire a perspective, each time a somewhat different one, of the whole. Well, that's exactly what I want to attempt. One more introductory comment seems in place. Though each of the three key terms can be said to indicate a main entrance to the whole of Dooyeweerd's philosophy, and, furthermore, the three are interrelated, the order in which they appear, i.e. are placed by me, is not arbitrary. I expect that our short promenade will shed some light on that order, but you may already have noticed that the name under which Dooyeweerd's philosophy as a whole was initially presented and became known, philosophy of the law idea or cosmonomic idea, is not the first guide to my approach. Even so, I'm not really self-opinionated, for in later years Dooyeweerd himself expressed dissatisfaction with that name, though not with the basic idea. But now it's time to start our brief reconnaissance. Number 1. Meaning. Starting with this key word, we are very close yet to the start Dooyeweerd himself makes in the opening paragraphs of his new critique. The very first section heading speaks of meaning as the mode of being of all that is created. In the section itself, the first thesis reads, "Meaning is the being of all that has been created, and the nature even of our selfhood." Most people who have read, or tried to read, Dooyeweerd are familiar with these statements and formulations. However, quite a few of these people also got stuck already there. For although in the same context Dooyeweerd offers some clarification by using terms like referring and expressing, and also qualifies his thesis as an introductory one, that, together with one or two other ones, contain in themselves the entire complex of problems involved in a discussion of the possibility of genuine philosophy, he does not so much there by way of terminological elucidation and discussion, or even show much awareness of the unusual twist he gives to that philosophically loaded term, meaning. Well, I believe he was aware of that, but I take it that on these introductory pages he was most concerned with bringing into the open what had fundamentally motivated his thought, i.e., with bringing out right away the newness and liberating significance of the perspective that had opened up to him, without undue attention to terminological subtlety. There is something comparable here to the first keynotes presenting the main theme of a musical symphony. Besides, if, as I see it, meaning serves as the most basic and most comprehensive philosophical characteristic of created reality, then it would be hard, if not senseless, to define it. Both terms, basic and comprehensive, should be taken in a dynamic sense. Indeed, meaning points precisely to the thoroughly dynamic character of all that there is, in and as creation, time and law included, though these also are encompassing categories in their own right. At any rate, there is no need to deny that there is an unusual twist in this statement on meaning. Not only Anglo-Saxon, but also European philosophers have raised the question, does meaning make sense? And I think that our procedure today and in a paper like this can and should be somewhat different without claiming to be able to come up with a definition of meaning. Negatively speaking, the first thing to do is to preclude a possible, for many philosophers even likely, understanding of meaning in terms of semantics. It is common practice among philosophers to regularly ask the question, what do you mean? Namely by that statement, that term, that phrase or expression. Or else, what does that term, etc. mean? I do not think that this is an improper use of meaning, and further on I will even try to indicate a connection between what Dooyeweerd has in mind and the more specifically semantic use of the term. But a direct understanding of meaning in a semantic context would cause misunderstanding. Positively, we get closer when we think of a usage which is rather ordinary. Expressions like the meaning of life, the meaning of history, and the like are not primarily semantic, but have a wider range. They evoke notions of goal and destination, and then not as something additional to life or history, but as something determining and directional. These notions, in turn, appear to be tied up with notions of origin and ground. Questions about goal and destination are bound to bring up questions concerning the latter. The child starting to ask why questions usually covers both sides at once. The picture that arises then is that of being on the way, having been sent going, and being goal-directed. Now, all this might seem to be somewhat trivial, but the point is that at least in one respect, Dooyeweerd's use of meaning is not so unusual. I even think that he deliberately wanted to stay close to that rather ordinary use and its broad range. For all its academic and technical features, philosophy should keep in touch with practical life and at least some of its concerns, as expressed in pregnant terms. Still, more needs to be said. I'd like to do that via a few questions. A. Apparently, what Dooyeweerd puts forward as his first basic thesis is even wider than the already broad use we just pointed out. Meaning is not just tied up with words like life or history, but is intended to characterize the being of all that has been created. What sense, if any, could that make? B. In our reference to expressions like the meaning of life, etc., we virtually neglected the fact that these expressions mostly figure in questions, namely, what is the meaning of life, or does history have meaning? Doesn't that indicate that even in that most ordinary and broad usage, the term does not seem to be simple and unproblematic? Perhaps the normal use of the term even presupposes a certain sort of question. And this might be important. I think it is, and I'll come back to it presently. C. A point that could also be brought up as an aspect of A and or B, even if we would allow for and could make sense of Dooyeweerd's broad use, as occasioned by and referring to some such expressions, isn't his identification of meaning and being quite a move, hard to understand and to accept? Do not even the mentioned expressions imply a distinctness between something that is life, history, and the possible meaning it has. Even if we would argue that in these cases having meaning is not simply additional to being there, Dooyeweerd's characterization of being in terms of meaning strikes one as radical and puzzling. I think it is useful to discuss these points, if only briefly. Such a discussion may facilitate the endeavour to point out some of the implications of Dooyeweerd's idea of meaning. But first, a short historical note. It is certainly not an idiosyncrasy on Dooyeweerd's part to show a vivid interest in meaning and to put forward that notion right away. The concern as such is characteristic of various leading philosophical schools in the 20th century. For the European continent, I am thinking especially of the hermeneutic phenomenological movement from Dilthey and Husserl to Heidegger and Gadamer. In Anglo-Saxon philosophy, the interest and concern are usually tied up with, and often narrowed down to, the semantic context which I indicated earlier. I don't think it's a matter of mere contingency that precisely in this century meaning became highlighted, even to such a degree that we can almost speak of a preoccupation. I will return to this while discussing the question mentioned under B. On the other hand, it is clear that Dooyeweerd's first and fundamental thesis remains original enough, meaning as the being of all that has been created. None of the philosophies just mentioned has ever asserted that. Small wonder. The intention as well as the radicalness of the assertion can only be understood in the light of the verb and its tense, created. This verb, indeed, signifies the light, almost a priorically given overwhelmingly but not absorbingly, and most universally present, that Dooyeweerd cannot help mentioning right from the beginning, because it has urged itself upon him. It qualifies his very first thesis. To put it differently, the thesis about meaning is primarily no more than a philosophical expression of an all-preceding confession of faith and of knowledge belonging to that faith. Compare Hebrews 11:3. It is by faith that we know that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what can be seen was made out of what cannot be seen. We might also say that, as such, it is an approximation in tentative terminology, but if it is no more than such an expression, it is no less either. Corrigible and, on principle, inadequate as it may be, the term meaning represents a serious attempt to let that enlightening faith in creation have full bearing on the philosophical enterprise in its inevitable and basic orientation to totality, to reality as a whole. As such, it does seem quite appropriate, especially when we take the concomitant and somewhat explanatory terms reference and expression into account. At this point, we may pick up our first question under A. Meaning, in Dooyeweerd's use, is intended to point to the radical and complete dependence of all there is in its very being. The same feature comes out in the words reference and expression. Reference is necessarily to something, and expression of something. As is often the case with philosophical key terms, however, the main significance appears when we see what other key words of the philosophical tradition it is to be contrasted with. Generally speaking, precluded is the idea that anything could exist in itself, and or could be known of itself. More specifically, notions like substance, essence, and, in a more modern context, subject or selfhood, are abandoned, insofar as they reveal philosophical attempts to disconnect, by way of, in itself legitimate theoretical abstraction, something from what is constitutive of its very nature, that is, its dependence, its being referential and expressive. The same holds for attempts to disconnect some modality of being and to give it the status of an ultimate horizon, basic denominator, the different isms like mathematicism, psychologism, logicism, technicism, historicism, etc. The abandonment of such notions and attempts does not prevent Dooyeweerd from recognizing their relative value. In the notion of substance, for example, he recognizes the awareness of the individuality and typical individuality structures of created things and persons, of their irreducibility to other individuals and or structures, an awareness which, in the more modern period with its predominantly functionalistic approach, was often lost or suppressed or narrowed down to some sort of atomism. As to the modern concentration on the human self, this is to be appreciated by a Christian thinker who, with surprise and humility, may believe that the created world has been made in such a way that it should manifest its overall dependence through mankind, given to be enjoyed in sharing, explored and dedicated. But the fact remains that in traditional thought there is more to these notions than this relative value, and basically they are at variance with a radical and integral recognition of creation. Dooyeweerd, however, does not leave the issue at a fundamental abandonment of these notions and at a simple attempt of replacing them with some global notion of meaning. He pursues the issue by careful and laborious investigations of their functioning in traditional philosophy. For one thing, this testifies to his awareness of the significance of history, in this case the history of thought. Ultimately, however, these investigations serve the purpose of bringing out the more positive side of meaning, of its power as a dynamic notion, manifesting itself even where it is not recognized and is distorted. Dooyeweerd tries to show, to put it briefly, that notions like substance, essence, transcendental subject, and some sort of ism could be sustained only in a dialectical relationship to, respectively, accidens, existence, object, and some other ism, and that whenever an attempt was made to separate them from that relationship, they became virtually empty or rather meaningless. Of course, it is impossible now in this paper to retrace these investigations, but the point should be clear. If the claim is correct, then it brings out, on the one hand, the essential relatedness of the notions concerned, and on the other hand, the curtailment and distortion of that relatedness due to a basic dualistic framework. Both elements are implied in the term dialectical. Over against that, meaning in Dooyeweerd is intended to indicate a non-dialectical, integral perspective of pervasive reference. As to the question relevant at this point of order and succession in this pervasive reference, a little more about that in the next section on time. There is only one fundamental duality to be acknowledged between God, the Creator, and created reality. But this duality precisely overcomes the dialectical dualisms with their curtailments, distortions and stagnations, because it makes possible a genuine recognition of the richness of creation in its integrality and variety of reference. At this point, one might ask if this view does not amount to an evaporation, meaning idealism as some have called it, of the reality of things, in their specificity as well as in their uniqueness. I already inserted a comment on that in my brief discussion of substance. But besides, everyone who makes the effort to study the whole of Dooyeweerd's work can see how he takes great pains to respect and point to diversity, even more so than most other philosophers I know, and to develop appropriate distinctions. Again, they remain tentative and corrigible, and the result is no need now to retrace or test them. And there is no need now to retrace or test them. The point now is that the respect for and concern with diversity and distinctness is not at odds with the fundamental ontological significance of meaning. To use a weak analogy, when we are admirers of a great artist, say a painter, we carefully and respectfully pay attention to each of his works and, at the same time, to general features of his paintings, composition, colouring, etc., as appearing in original combination in each work, to its characteristics as belonging to an oeuvre, which, in turn, is ultimately to be characterized as the unique expression of that artist. If we want to summarize what has been said so far regarding the connotation of meaning, we might say that all that has been created, philosophically speaking, can be characterized as referential to and expressive of the Creator God. A, who does not coincide with it. B, on whom it is existentially dependent. C, whom it in rich diversity may reveal, unfolding the full richness also of its patterns in its history, which is the thorough and all-inclusive preparation for the final destination, the feast of love. The latter part of this sentence is just added here. We will get back to it in the next section. But in the present context, this way of putting it may serve to indicate what I see as the deepest motivation in heeding the duality between God and created reality, the profound respect for the unique partner of love, who created by and with love, longing for the final feast, and spending royally for the wedding dress, the respect for the law, emphasized by Dooyeweerd as the boundary between God and cosmos, see last section, and for God as lawgiver, should not be isolated from this motivation. I assume that the preceding interpretation has also implicitly supplied an answer to questions raised under A and C, or at least has removed some possible misunderstandings behind those questions. I do realize, however, that there are and have been other questions which do not so much rise from puzzlement by the meaning of meaning, but touch upon aspects or modes of being that, in Dooyeweerd's basic thesis, either seem to be neglected or can be only improperly accounted for. I am thinking of such issues, not particularly unfamiliar to Calvin College philosophers, as the existence of God, the ontological status of universals, more specifically numbers, mathematical and logical truths. It is, of course, tempting to engage in a discussion of these questions. However, I believe this is not the place and time to do so. It would also be presumptuous on my part, in view of the intellectual power, care and subtlety manifested by the arguments presented. On the other hand, there is a fundamental issue at stake which regards all of us as Christian thinkers. In view of that, it should be clearly said that Dooyeweerd's position indeed precludes any talk of existence in which that word would be predicated both of God and of created reality, if only analogically. This formulation may sound Kantian, but in fact Dooyeweerd simply joins the reformers Luther and Calvin on this point, in their struggle with and position over against medieval theology and philosophy. What is at stake for all of them can be brought out best by raising the question: what other sense could exist or exists as connected with God make than the one exclusively and directly revealed by himself in the word he has spoken? Is it not the unique prerogative of the Creator to tell us that and how he exists? And if this would sound as only part of the truth and therefore as too restricted, the next question would be, hasn't the how of his existence progressively, abundantly, and more intimately been shown in the history of his revelation, roughly from Exodus 3:12 to 15, in its whole context, the concerned one and the Redeemer, including a final and deliberate touch of mystery, through the prophecies of Isaiah, the Gospel of John 1 verses 1 to 3, the Epistle of the Colossians, chapter 1, 15 to 17, culminating in the overarching song of worship in Revelations 4, verses 8 and 11, and perspective of Revelation 22, verse 13. Clearly, all this is said in language of faith. This also holds for texts like Hebrews 11, verse 6, and James 2, verse 19, i.e. in created language, but used by the Creator to reveal ultimate truths, that is, as to what he is for us and with us, including the whole of his creation. Faith language means that our appropriate reaction can only be in terms of response, culminating, as indicated, in praise and worship. That is to say, entirely dependent on God speaking. If we wish, we may say that there is a propositional side to such language, as well as, for example, an emotional side, just as there are such sides to the statement made, repeatedly but never boringly, in a relationship of good marriage, I love you. Propositional insofar as we have to do with something which can be asserted, and there may be a risk in neglecting that side. But it is more risky to neglect that the statement as such is not to be characterized as a proposition, nor for that matter as an expression of an emotion, because it is not so meant, nor meant to be so understood. How could it be a proposition in the proper sense of the term, if to the more complete definition thereof belongs that it is true or false, and already in I love you as uttered and understood in the mentioned relationship, The question of true or false simply does not and cannot arise, and a fortiori cannot arise with respect to the assertions made by one who said, see the Gospel of John, I am the truth, to be heard against the background of the overpowering and radiating open sentences of the same Gospel. That's why I use the tentative expression propositional side. So far, what I believe I had to say on the issue of God's existence, not so much by way of argument, but by way of elucidation of a fundamental stance that was a matter of deep concern for Dooyeweerd and, I take it, remains one for every committed Christian thinker. Let me add just a few words yet on existing, thereby returning again to what I already said on meaning. As soon as we recognize the exclusiveness and salutary authority of God's speaking of his own existence, and our impossibility to know or learn about that otherwise than in the always fresh hearing of faith, nothing precludes the widest possible use of existing. That is, everything else exists as created by this God. This is another faith statement yet, and the same applies to the assertion that this means everything else owes its stability as provided by God's laws, see below, its variety, coherence and life entirely to him. Dooyeweerd's position on this point is not generally accepted among Christian thinkers, I know. It does preclude a view of, for example, mathematical and logical truths as uncreated and or somehow coeval with God. But I myself can only see and agree with Dooyeweerd's position as a direct consequence of a surrender to words like Romans 11:36 and the for Israel all-dominating "Hear Israel" of Deuteronomy 6, stressing God's absolute uniqueness, not something like essential oneness or simplicity. That there is something special about mathematical and logical truths is recognized and allowed for also by Dooyeweerd, on his account of the order in the different modalities of being and experience. Mathematical structures can be called primordial. They are basic to and even in the structuration of everything else. As to logicality, this can also be said to be primordial, though in a more restricted sense. It is basic to and in the structuration of all our conscious experience. However, this does not prevent Dooyeweerd from maintaining that the meaning character of reality applies here too. Just a brief and simple illustration. The number 100 in connection with dollars, $100, remains a number in its own right, with its mathematical properties and relationships. The whole economic phenomenon of money even presupposes quantity and numbers. But in its connection with dollars, or rather, in its reappearance within the economic context, it gets a special variability, even a different kind of value that the mathematician Quartalis cannot, and does not have to, account for, and that precisely requires a special science, economics, for its explanation. An even more striking illustration is what Paul says about marriage, numbers in a moral relationship, and the two shall become one. A possible explanation of such a statement in terms of metaphor seems to me to be an all too verbal solution, tenable only on nominalist assumptions. What appeals to me in Dooyeweerd's account is the much more realistic recognition of typicality and open-endedness, at the same time, in short, of meaningful referential existence. On the other hand, and this is what I alluded to earlier when mentioning the semantic use of meaning, language seems to have a certain privileged position, perhaps underestimated by Dooyeweerd, in that it serves to denote meaning by way of symbols throughout. But even so, denoting and denotability is different from comprising. Meaning can be and remain silent. After this short excursion, which I hope also indicates a little more of the articulation in Dooyeweerd's conception of meaning, it is high time to get back to the point raised under B. There you may recall, it was suggested that the normal use of the term meaning might presuppose a question or questions, and that this might be important. A brief discussion of this point will not so much bring out features hitherto unmentioned, but may contribute to a better understanding of what meaning is all about. To put it succinctly, Dooyeweerd introduces meaning as a basic and comprehensive term, on the one hand because he realizes that the older term being, originating in Greek philosophy, is not sufficient anymore as a most comprehensive term. On the other hand, because he also feels the need to face the increasing experience of meaninglessness in modern and contemporary times, philosophically manifested in a certain preoccupation with the problem of meaning, and more existentially in an awareness of inward and outward alienation. As to the first, to characterize the whole of reality as meaning presupposes, historically speaking, that reality, in its being there, is no longer self-enclosed and self-evident as a last and ultimate horizon, if only of contingency. That, therefore, in a sense, it has become questionable. But the room, the opening required for that has precisely been brought about by the biblical belief in creation, with its explicit acknowledgement of a fundamental distinction between the Creator and the created world, which at the same time thoroughly opens that world towards him. That openness is liberating, in that it breaks through and overcomes a basic, scarcely concealed resignation to contingency, as well as the complementary effort to elevate certain things and or oneself to a supernatural or noumenal realm. That openness has not been undone since. However, starting from the Renaissance, and this brings us to the second aspect, modern man has made the effort, often very serious and impressive one, to fill the open space by himself and on his own terms. Today, the failure is at least as impressive as the effort was. The result of creative meaning giving is a real alienation from oneself and from the things surrounding man. Dooyeweerd's fundamental thesis, meaning is the being of all that has been created and the nature even of our selfhood, is also tuned in to that situation in order to radically overcome it. There is no time to pursue elaborations and variations of the main theme, interesting and significant as they may be, for further clarification and also as a way of testing consistency and coherence. To conclude this section, a few comments on the disruption of reality, which in our elucidation of the thesis on meaning, so far seems to have been ignored. In other words, we touch upon the problem of evil. Obviously, we cannot deal with this hard and bitter problem here, but timely it is in an increased and intense sensitivity of many people all over the world, and as a major concern in contemporary philosophy. Well, Dooyeweerd too gives ample evidence of his being baffled with the disruption and corruption, with its depth and its breadth, affecting even the law side of reality. The thesis on meaning, liberating as it is intended to be, does not make him blind for the incisiveness of evil, for the overwhelming experience of what is sometimes called meaninglessness. He clearly struggled with that, but his thinking does not allow for any sort of philosophical justification of it, nor for resignation to it. The perplexity does not abolish the meaning character of reality. It rather presupposes that character. Bewilderment, suffering, pain are what they are, precisely because as creatures we expect the world to be meaningful. And God saw that it was good. How utterly serious and involved that seeing was, became fully clear in his personal coming to bear and to save. It is here that the emphasis on the concentration of meaning in Jesus Christ gets its full significance. It is only in the ultimate reference to the suffering Lamb of God, completely identical with the Word and light through which all things came to be, that the thesis on meaning passes the test.